We start our creation unit by taking a look at what's considered to be the first recorded epic or creation story, and that's Gilgamesh. Now, I say it's the first recorded one because there may be earlier creation stories from earlier cultures, but this is the first one that we have that we've discovered that's been actually written down. And I'll give a little bit of the history of Gilgamesh a little bit later, but as we look at this story, I want to kind of go back and hit some of the big questions, and these, if you want to consider to be like your catechism questions, you can. But these are some of the questions that our early creation stories attempt to answer. And they're worth looking at because they give us kind of a context as we move forward on what to look at as we're looking at these creation stories. So with Gilgamesh, with Genesis, with the other stories we'll encounter, they tend to try to answer one or more, or if not all, of these questions. So the first one is, what is the position of this people, this particular culture, this particular tribe, the people who created this story? What is their position in the world? Are they supreme? Do they consider themselves to be chosen in some way, shape, or form? Or are they just like everybody else? You'll notice in many creation stories that creation of mankind takes place after there are already people populating the world. And so it's almost like the gods or the god takes a moment to create a particular type or group of people or tribe of people that will be the chosen ones, the ones who are considered blessed by that god or by that deity. The second question is looking at how does the myth, and I'll call these stories largely myths, because a myth is simply any story, whether it's true or has elements of fiction to it, whether it's true or not, that gets passed on from one generation to the next. So in that sense, almost all stories are myths as long as there's a continual narrative of them. So how does the myth suggest the proper approach to understanding the world and man's place in it? So where do we fit in the hierarchy of living things? Where do we fit in the hierarchy of the universe? Is it a structured universe? Do we have a proper place? Is that place in a superior position, an inferior position to others that we also encounter in the world? And then a third question is, what is man's position or role in the world? So when we look at man specifically, we might be looking at the distinction between man and woman. Is that distinction made? Is the distinction made between parents and children, between humans and animals? So what is the role? Are we caretakers of this world, or do we serve another function? And then fourthly, what is man's relationship to the divine? What place do we have in this world that God has created? And what is his relationship to us like? Is it distant? Is it close? Is he friend? Is he foe? Is it a he? Or is it several gods? So these questions are all questions that are attempted to be answered through creation stories. We'll deal with them as we work through our Gilgamesh and Genesis units in particular. So Gilgamesh is really the story of the world's first bromance. It's two individuals who become friends. One of them is named Gilgamesh, the other is named Enkidu. The two of them are very similar, but they're also very unalike as well. And so what we're going to do is take a look at the first chapter of Gilgamesh, where this relationship is set up, but it's also the place where we find the creation story, okay? And then we'll be able to connect that creation story to the other ones that we do as well. So now I'll begin a reading of this first chapter, and I want to remind you that we're working with a translation, and Gilgamesh comes to us in several, actually well over 20,000 different tablets that were broken and chipped and pieces are missing. So in most translations, there are attempts to fill in the gaps for some of these missing elements. I particularly like this translation because I think it's very user-friendly. It's easy to kind of get into the story. But just so you understand that Gilgamesh is very, very, very old, and it was not discovered until really the 1800s that it had been lost and then rediscovered by some archaeologists and untranslatable to a large extent. The tablets that were found, some 20,000 in nature, were then all transported to the British Museum in England, and there they were pieced together, they were interpreted and translated, and then we had several versions coming out. But Gilgamesh really serves to be our first piece of written text that we consider to be unique from law codes, from religious ceremonies, from census data. It truly is a story, and it comes to us as an epic poem. So Gilgamesh begins with a prologue, and I'll read it to you, and I want you to imagine that our narrator, the person who's telling our story, is wanting to give a little bit of a background to what's going on and who this great warrior king named Gilgamesh is. So he begins, "I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. This was the man to whom all things were known. This was the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise, he saw mysteries and knew secret things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. He went on a long journey, was weary, worn out with labor, returning he rested. He engraved on a stone the whole story." So it's lucky for us that he wrote down all of his adventures, otherwise they would be lost. But there's something interesting here. He talks about the days before the flood, and this is really what made Gilgamesh interesting to archaeologists and scholars. It's within the story of Gilgamesh is embedded the story of Noah. Only the character, his name changes to a man named Utnapishtim. And the story relates about a man named Utnapishtim who, along with his wife, were told of a great flood that was going to be put on the earth because mankind was far too noisy. And so when they unleashed the flood, Utnapishtim and his wife had gathered 2 of every kind of animal in a boat, and they had saved the entire world. And for their troubles, they were granted the gift of immortality. And so when scholars saw this, they said, this is proof of the Genesis version of the flood story. So they looked at Gilgamesh as this kind of hopeful story. Even though Gilgamesh, as a piece of written document, comes to us almost 1,500 years before we get some of these early Old Testament recountings of Genesis. When the gods created Gilgamesh, they gave him a perfect body. Shamash, the glorious sun, endowed him with beauty. Adad, the god of the storm, endowed him with courage. The great gods made his beauty perfect, surpassing all others, terrifying like a great wild bull. 2/3 they made him god, and 1/3 man. Now, what's important to note here is that Gilgamesh, like many great epic heroes, is going to be part god, part human. And that's not something to ignore. And what we have here is one of the first accounts of what we will later refer to as the hero cycle. So Joseph Campbell, who's a leading mythologist and scholar, he's the guy who kind of came up with a lot of these mythic studies. But the idea of the hero cycle, this kind of template for a story that's going to be told again and again throughout time, begins really with Gilgamesh. And so we see this first setup, this template of a hero who is part god, part man. He is made in the image of the divine. So we'll see this again when we do Genesis and we talk about Adam being made in God's image. Gilgamesh too is made in the image, only he is 2/3 God, 1/3 man. I'm not sure exactly how that works, if he has 3 parents, who knows. In Uruk he built walls, a great rampart, and the temple of the blessed Ina, of the god of the firmament, anew, and for Ishtar, the goddess of love. Look at it still today, the outer wall where the cornice runs. It shines with the brilliance of copper. In the inner wall, it has no equal. Touch the threshold, it is ancient. Approach Iana, the dwelling of Ishtar, our lady of love and war, the like of which no latter-day king, no man alive can equal. Climb upon the wall of Uruk, walk along it, I say, regard the foundation terrace, and examine the masonry. Is it not burnt brick and good? The 7 sages laid the foundations. And so what we've got is the opening, and we are told that this is no slouch of a king. This is a beautiful city that is civilized. This is the world that civilization has built, and he has built it to be lasting, he has built it to be mighty. And he calls on us to open a special box where the story of Gilgamesh is being told and laid out. And so we can imagine opening that box and unfurling the document that comes next, which is where chapter 1 begins, and it will begin on the next video.